Hello everyone, and welcome to the game you've all been waiting for. We are in the second half of the Norway Chess Tournament, one of the strongest classical chess events in the world, and today we witness a historic clash between the current world champion Gukesh and the former world champion Magnus Carlsen. In their earlier encounter in the first half of the tournament, Magnus Carlsen won a very high-quality game, so coming into this rematch, Gukesh was not only looking to improve his tournament standing, but also aiming for his first-ever classical victory against Magnus Carlsen. Magnus, as always, was looking to press from start to finish and convert even the smallest advantage. With that context in mind, let's dive straight into this fascinating battle. Gukesh has the white pieces and opens the game with pawn to e4, immediately claiming space in the center. Magnus responds symmetrically with pawn to e5. Gukesh continues development with knight to f3, attacking the e5 pawn, and Magnus defends with knight to ce6. Now Gukesh plays bishop to b5, and we have the Ruy Lopez on the board. Magnus responds with knight to f6, entering the Berlin defense. Instead of going for the main Berlin endgame, Gukesh chooses a quieter system with pawn to d3, keeping the game complex. Magnus develops actively with bishop to h5, and Gukesh supports the center with pawn to ce3, preparing a future pawn to d4. Magnus castles kingside, Gukesh follows with kingside castling, and Magnus reinforces the center with pawn to d6. At this stage, everything is very standard and well known. Gukesh plays pawn to h3, preventing any piece from jumping to g4. Magnus replies with pawn to a6, questioning the bishop on b5, and Gukesh retreats it calmly to a4. Magnus mirrors white's kingside idea with pawn to h6, stopping bishop or knight ideas on g5. Gukesh centralizes a rook with rook to e1. Magnus gains queenside space with pawn to b5, and Gukesh retreats the bishop again to c2. Instead of playing known moves like bishop to b7 or rook to e8, Magnus surprises everyone with bishop to b6, creating a new position early in the game. Gukesh reacts calmly and continues development with knight to d2. Magnus follows with knight to e7, indicating maneuvering plans rather than immediate tactics. Gukesh now strikes on the queen side with pawn to a4, gaining space on the flank. Magnus reacts actively with rook to b8, lining up pressure. Gukesh then hits the center with pawn to d4, a very thematic move. Magnus responds with knight to g6, eyeing key central squares. Gukesh repositions his knight with knight to f1, preparing to reroute it to g3. Magnus challenges the center with pawn to c5, and Gukesh continues development with knight to g3. Magnus captures in the center with pawn from c5, captures on d4, and Gukesh recaptures with pawn from c3, captures on d4. Magnus then captures away from the center with pawn from b5, captures on a4, and Gukesh responds with pawn from b3, captures on a4. Magnus develops his bishop to b7, completing queenside development. Now comes a very strong positional decision by Gukesh, pawn to d5. This move is extremely powerful as it shuts down Magnus's light-squared bishop and locks the center. Magnus reacts with pawn to a5, trying to activate the bishop via the diagonal. Gukesh develops actively with bishop to e3, offering a bishop trade. Magnus retreats the bishop back to c8, and Gukesh plays pawn to b3, defending the bishop on c2 and controlling important squares. Magnus accepts the trade with bishop captures on e3, and Gukesh recaptures with rook captures on e3. Magnus jumps in aggressively with knight to f4, creating pressure. Gukesh responds by improving piece placement with bishop to ac6, placing the bishop on a very strong diagonal. Instead of capturing on h3, Magnus chooses a positional approach and plays rook to b4, clearly targeting the pawn on e4. Gukesh defends with queen to c2. Magnus supports his kingside with pawn to g6, and Gukesh steps away from future checks with king to h1. Magnus activates his bishop with bishop to a6, and Gukesh plays queen to a2. This allows Magnus to play a very strong move, bishop to d3, increasing pressure on e4. Gukesh defends again with knight to d2. Magnus continues his plan with pawn to h5, preparing to remove defenders around the king. Gukesh captures on a5 with pawn captures on a5. Magnus recaptures with queen captures on a5, and the queens are traded as rook captures on a5. Magnus pushes pawn to h4, and Gukesh finds an interesting defensive resource with rook to a4. Magnus responds with the strongest continuation, rook from f8 to b8. Gukesh retreats the rook back to a2, and Magnus improves king safety with king to g7. Gukesh tries to generate counterplay with rook to a7, but Magnus calmly centralizes with rook to d4. Gukesh attacks the rook with knight to f3. Magnus captures with pawn from h4 captures on g3, and Gukesh recaptures with pawn from f2 captures on g3. Magnus continues with knight captures on h3, and Gukesh recaptures with pawn from g2 captures on h3. Magnus finally wins the central pawn with bishop captures on e4, achieving a key positional goal. Gukesh unpins and improves king safety with king to h2. Magnus activates his rook with rook to d1 and continues kingside play with pawn to h4. Gukesh creates breathing room with pawn to g4. Magnus captures in the center with bishop captures on d5. Gukesh recaptures with bishop captures on d5, and Magnus follows with knight captures on d5. Gukesh repositions his rook with rook to e2, and Magnus stabilizes his knight with knight to f4. Magnus now begins marching his king forward with king to f6, then pawn to h4, and king to e6, showing great confidence. Gukesh looks for counterplay with knight to g5, but Magnus calmly steps forward with king to d5. Gukesh checks with rook to a 5 check. Magnus continues with king to d4, and after another check with rook to a 4 check, Magnus plays king to d3. Gukesh tries rook to f2, and here Magnus should have played pawn to f5, but instead he plays pawn to f6, allowing counterplay. Gukesh immediately checks with rook to f3 check. Magnus responds with king to e2. Gukesh gives another check with rook to a 2 check, and Magnus blocks with rook to d2. The rooks are exchanged, and Gukesh plays knight to a4 with check. Magnus responds with king to e2, and Gukesh improves his king with king to g3. Magnus pushes pawn to d5. Gukesh captures with knight captures on f6. Magnus tries rook to f8, and after rook to f2 check and king to e1, Gukesh plays knight to d7, reaching a critical moment. After precise maneuvering, Gukesh finds the key idea with knight to e6, followed by knight to c5 and knight to a4, creating decisive threats. Magnus pushes pawn to e4, but Gukesh counters with pawn to h5, knight to b2, and knight to c4 with check. Magnus plays king to e2, and now comes the final winning move, king to f4. In this position, Magnus Carlsen resigns, as there is no defense left against the advancing pawns and coordinated pieces. This game marks Gukesh's first-ever classical victory against Magnus Carlsen. Magnus was pressing for most of the game, But Gukesh showed incredible resilience, defended with precision, and never stopped playing the best possible moves, even in difficult positions. It is a historic victory, a huge confidence boost, and one of the most memorable games of the tournament. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you soon with more chess analysis.